Welcome to our joint webinar around TSA, ISO27001 and the NIS2 frameworks. I'd like to start off first with a few brief introductions, if I may. My name is Kunal. I am the Associate Director at IC Consult UK with a focus on identity governance and administration. And I'm delighted today to be joined by our guest, Alan Radford. Alan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kunal. So my name's Alan Radford. I'm what we call a field strategist here at One Identity. My predominant focus is understanding the problem space for our customers and from a solution space, understanding how we align to help our customers solve the business challenges and problems that they face from an identity, access management, security perspective. My focus is privileged access management, and I'm delighted to be invited here today, Kunal, to talk about PAM compliance.
Thank you very much, Alan. Before we dive into the meat and bones, as I say, of the topic, just a very quick intro about us, IC Consult. IC Consult was founded 25 years ago in Germany, and we've been operating in the UK for about 6 years now. And we assist our global customers with complex IAM and PAM programs. Globally, we've got about 850 consultants, all focused on identity and access management only. And we assist at all stages of the IAM program. We also offer business consulting to customers, and of course, all the way from integration, implementation, and through to support, as well as managed services. And I'm especially delighted today to be co-hosting this with One Identity, who are our strategic partners. We've been working with them for over 10 years, and IC Consult is one of the few companies globally that holds a dual Platinum and Premier Plus partner status with One Identity. With that said, I'd like to hand over quickly to Alan to give us a quick introduction about One Identity, specifically the unified security platform.
Yeah, thanks, Kunal. So here at One Identity, we've been converging different identity silos since around 2010. Prior to that, we've been working with something called Active Role Server, which is a way of securing Active Directory in terms of workflow, IAM, and privilege elevation. And then in 2010, we made two key acquisitions. One was Volker Informatik out of Germany, which is the foundation of our identity governance platform, One Identity Manager. And another acquisition was a company called EDMZ, which was the author or provider of the PAM product, which formed the basis of our privileged access management offering. Since similar sort of time frame, we've been the only corporate sponsor of the Sudo project for any Unix fans out there. And we've been doing these silos for a very, very long time. More recently, we acquired Balabit, which was the vendor for Shell Control Box and Syslog NG in 2018. And in 2020, we acquired access management provider OneLogin. Between those acquisitions and various others that I won't bore you with, and a lot of organic development and growth over the years, we've been unifying these areas of identity governance, privilege access, access management, and Active Directory management security into one cohesive solution for our customers. We deliver these either as on-premise or SaaS, whatever deployment model makes sense for your organization, which is most likely in a hybrid state at the moment. When you actually bring these silos together, a number of key benefits comes out of the woodwork, not just in terms of the actual solution itself, but in terms of the investments around the training of people. We're all feeling in the cybersecurity space challenges around recruitment, finding the right skills, finding the right affordable skills, and so on. And training into a single vendor as part of the vendor consolidation strategy has its own benefits as well, not to mention the other benefits around dealing with change management and so on. So we've been very pleased to bring this solution to market, to be the first to bring it to market, and to help our customers realize the value of consolidating these silos when it comes to things like workflow orchestration, business intelligence, and identity correlation, whether that identity is a human identity or a virtual identity or a device identity, and so on. And so that unified platform is somewhere where our customers can start anywhere. We're not trying to be Apple, we never will. And so we have everything under one R&D house that we can bring that value to our customers, and we can, of course, work with the wider ecosystem as and where we need to as well. So yeah, we are currently owned by Quest Software, and I think that sums us up quite nicely, Kunal.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think that's a very, very nice overview of the unified identity security platform, and I think later on we'll have a look on how this platform can specifically help us get compliant with some of these frameworks we're going to talk about. And speaking of these frameworks, I think it'll be very good to first get an overview on how they overlap and how they're different. What makes them similar as well as different from each other at the same time, Alan?
Yeah, so we sort of cherry picked, didn't we, Kunal, of which ones to talk about, because there's quite a lot out there. ISO 27001 is very much a baseline certification. It is by no means mandatory. We One Identity have to be ISO 27001 certified because it helps with our integrity for our customers. And it establishes a number of baselines around security practices for things like asset management, access management, so on and so forth, so that you have a security baseline of which to move forward. It's quite broad in scope, focuses a lot on different processes as well. And ISO 27001 is globally recognized, global scope. Any organization of any size can apply for it, and then it's certified every 6 months, I think, maybe still. It was recently updated in 2022 from the original version, which was published in 2013. NIS2, on the other hand, is smaller in geographic scope. NIS2 is an EU directive, and that EU directive comes into force October this year. So it will be on top of mind for many European businesses out there. It is mandatory, it carries with it a fine, but as a directive, what I find interesting is it tells you where to go, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to get there, which I think is an interesting nuance. ISO 27001 does a lot of that for you. Okay, and then finally, the Telecommunications Security Act, which is a little bit smaller in scope, where it applies to the telcos out of the UK. It is written by the UK government, and it has come about very much the same sort of time frame as NIS2. But unlike NIS2, it gives a great deal of detail about specific controls and how to implement them and how to architect your security posture. So it's these three we felt would be the most interesting ones to pick on for you. There are others out there, PCI, SOX, etc., and so on, all of which, including the three in front of you, do merit their own webinars of themselves. But in terms of highlighting PAM and the key advantages in these ones, this felt like a good place to start.
Absolutely. Now, this is really good. Thank you, Alan. So it looks like sort of ISO being a much wider scope, a much bigger compliance framework, and we can almost look at NIS and TSA as a smaller parts of it. So that's where they sort of tend to overlap a bit, and also how they're different as well. So thank you very much for this, for the overview of that one, Alan. And I think we're going to tackle each of them as we go, again, from top down. So let's start with a bit of ISO 27001. So what can you tell us about the domains in there, Alan?
Yeah, so there's plenty of domains in ISO 27001. Like I said, it was updated in 2013. One of the things that they did was they simplified it a great deal. There were lots and lots and lots of different moving parts that were around things like compliance, risk management, asset management, HR security, access controls, even touches software development, testing and implementation, change management's in there, disaster recovery, business continuity. the list goes on and on and on. It's quite far-reaching. The mantra of the CIA sort of triangle, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, runs through the DNA there as well. And what they did was they took all of those different domains and consolidated them into the 4 you see on the screen: technology, people, organizational, and physical. In terms of the number of domains, you're talking about like 114 controls of 14 domains in 2013, which could consolidated into these 4 domains, but 93 controls. And each control is audited. Each control has something to offer. And one piece of advice I'll throw in here, perhaps prematurely, is the compliance frameworks are very, very useful. ISO especially, because of the breadth of it. And the graphic we had up just now, Kunal, I love that graphic because it really highlights the point that, you know, if you certify ISO 27001, you get the majority of the way there for most other compliance frameworks that touch security. Okay, it's a great baseline. And I think I saw a statistic the other day where it was like in the last 3 years, the number of certifications for ISO 27001 globally jumped by like 450% or something ridiculous. So all of these compliance frameworks that are getting pushed, again, NIS2 and TSA both very recently been renewed as well. They are driving customers to say, well, if I get my ISO certification, then I get most of the way there anyway. It's a great place to start.
Brilliant. Yeah, certainly looks like so. And just to show that beautiful picture once more, so as we can see, the overarching sort of ISO being the sort of the baseline framework, if you like, and getting more specialized as we go into NIS and TSA. So what are some of the key points then in ISO? I appreciate there's a lot more, but we try to distill it down, Alan, on sort of just the bigger pieces, right?
Yeah, so there is a lot of breadth. It talks about, from an identity perspective, being able to identify users. A lot of it, when you read through it, a lot of it is common sense. From an identity management perspective, you know, you need to know who these users are. You need to know what accounts they're using. They need to have a principle of least privilege. There needs to be an ability to audit what they're doing. There needs to be break glass processes for any privilege access management. There needs to be privilege access management. There's MFA talked about. There's about logging and recording. It's quite full featured in terms of these are all the different controls you need to put in place in these processes across your business in order to certify. Identity governance, privilege access management, and Active Directory management, all 4 of the domains we spoke about earlier at One Identity, all 4 of those are relevant in ISO 27001.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alan. I think that's quite a good overview of what is essentially quite a deep framework. I think you've very rightly captured the essence of ISO 27001, and which will certainly help our attendees here, I hope. So from ISO, then let's move on to the more specialized one, which is NIS2. Can you talk a little bit about NIS2, Alan?
Yeah, sure. So NIS2 is the first EU-wide law on cybersecurity. I did a deliberate Freudian slip there. NIS2 is not the first. NIS1 would be the first. NIS1 came about in 2016 and quite OT focused, at a glance, quite heavily focused on critical infrastructure. But then it wasn't widely adopted. It wasn't widely enforced. And so they went back to the drawing board and they came back with NIS2, which expands the scope somewhat. So some of the organizations added to scope will be on the next slide. But NIS2 expanded in scope. They wrapped a enforcement policy around it. And then they started putting a team together. I believe it's called Tornado for the EU, which is basically the EU's central cybersecurity team. And then started saying to all the different organizations that are beholden to NIS2, hey, look, You need to have your own what are called CSIRTs. You need to have your own team of people to be able to look after this. A CSIRT being a computer security incident response team. And those would be the people in your organization to be responsible for reporting back into the central NIS body. This is what our security posture is. These are the security events that we are seeing, and this is how we've addressed them. So there's a spirit of collaboration across it as well.
So you briefly mentioned NIS2 and some of the sectors that it applies to, being an EU directive. So we can see some of them splashed up on the screen. Is there any particular ones of interest here, Alan?
I think it's quite cool. Like, I'm a child of the 80s, so I thought it was quite cool that DNS providers are sort of seen as like a type of critical infrastructure. I thought that was a nice nod. I like the idea of that. I like the internet providers is basically seen the same as water and electricity. I also like that they've included the space industry there as well. It's a case of like the heaviest users of OT historically would be like critical infrastructure. But when you take a step back, you look at like manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, you look at space industry, and so on and so forth. Healthcare as well. OT and telecommunications. OT is increasingly everywhere, and carries with it its own sort of needs for how we protect it. Air gap systems, sensors that should or should not be cloud enabled. You know, there are providers of gas valves out there that have cloud enabled gas valve systems, which would carry with it certain amounts of risk depending on how you deploy it. Others that are not cloud enabled would be used in different areas depending on where in the organization it makes sense to use. And some of these OT devices carry risk to life. In the world of cybersecurity at the enterprise, you know, in ICT, for example, it's very easy to become complacent about how and why we secure Active Directory. If there's a breach, maybe there's data loss and there's a fine. But in the world of NIS2, it carries a risk to life in many of these organizations. And so this act of law is there to make sure that these controls take place and they're enforced. Touching back to ISO 27001 briefly, I'll just reiterate NIS2, when you read through it, it's not very specific about what actual controls you need and how to implement them. It's more destination orientated. This is where you need to be. You need to have this team in place, and these are the processes that you need to follow to become compliant in NIS2. But when it comes to actually implementing the security itself, ISO 27001 is a great aid for this. If you're ISO 27001 certified, you're 3/4 of the way there with NIS2. The only things that would maybe go outside of that from a NIS2 perspective are things like supply chain management, where you need to go a little bit deeper in that, and a bit more of an OT focus on the security practices there as well. ISO 27001 is very broad, it doesn't focus on OT, NIS2 focuses on OT.
Fantastic, thank you, Alan. You mentioned briefly earlier that there's a fine associated for not being NIS2 compliant. How does that work with the GDPR? Is that separate to it, or is there a double whammy in place there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So NIS2 carries with it like €10 million fine and I believe 2% annual turnover, whichever one's the greater. Similar in concept to GDPR. You mentioned double whammy. There's no double whammy. So if an organization, a European organization that falls into some of these categories, if they suffer a breach, and I would add that the categories on the screen is not the complete list. Okay, this is a subset. But if you have a breach that results in both GDPR and NIS2 having been compromised, then you don't get fined for both. The fine that's issued is simply the greater of the two.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Alan. I think that's a very, very important point. So we can summarize some of the key points that you've already mentioned around here in this slide before, and we can see the need for the strong security measures and the cooperation focused NIS2 amongst the different member states.
Yeah, and I'll take the opportunity to just make another comment, if I may. I'm not a lawyer. Okay, so anybody attending expecting legal advice, okay, I ain't giving you legal advice. All right, this is the perspective of cybersecurity professionals. But yeah, what I love about it is a spirit of cooperation and information sharing. You know, current world events, the internet is another theatre of war, fact, and with that carries a lot of dangers out there, where you've got state actors taking operations to a next level through black hat attacks. Critical infrastructure and OT are prime targets for that. Okay, and a lot of organizations of that ilk are recruiting skills such as reverse engineering, machine code to assembly to object orientation, because the actual OT devices themselves a lot of the time are operating in assembly languages. You know, so it's quite interesting, and I find reassuring that organizations like the EU are going, no, come on, okay, if you are under any of these banners for OT, for any of these industries, you may very well be a target of state-sponsored attacks, okay? And so we need to do something about that. But also, if one of you is attacked, the rest of you need to know that that attack is taking place, and you need to know within 24 hours. So there's a 24-hour mandate for a time window for when you need to actually have an instant response from your CSERT team. Significant events within 24 hours, full notification within 3 days, and then within a month, a fully detailed report, so that other organizations beholden to NIS2 can learn from what's happening. So it's almost like taking some SOC principles and applying that at a wider scale. Well, that's what it feels like going through it anyway. Some of the areas of focus, and I know we'll come to that, yeah. Touch a lot of identity management. A lot of identity vendors will say to you that identity is the new perimeter. I'm just going to flat out say it. It's not the new perimeter. It's been the perimeter for quite some time. It's just that with the state of digital transformation being the way it is, we're only just waking up to that. In our personal lives, you know, all of the, like, I counted the number of accounts I was using the other day. I got bored at 63. And that's not like an age joke. That's I've got too many accounts to even bother counting them. And that's just me, Alan Radford, personally. I have challenges with my kids using Switches and PlayStations, and then signing up to games from people like Ubisoft, and then having all of those accounts linking to each other, unlinking to each other, and so on. Another identity management problem. The reason I'm rambling about this is that it highlights the point that our digital lives are transforming at a significant pace. That is happening in society as well. The European Union are recognizing that with NIS2, and they are taking steps to make sure that the risk that that poses, that they keep up with that. A lot of these areas here, as I mentioned, touch on identity, cryptography there. I'll pick on crypto agility. You know, if you've got certificates and you've got encryption keys in your organization, how many have you got? Do you know? Do you care? If they're laying around, I would argue that that's equally as valid as a username and password just laying around. You don't need these things laying around. Who owns it? Why is it there? Does it need to exist? What does it allow you to access? If we don't know, we need to find out. So crypto agility is a big area. It's part of the DevOps itch that we're seeing needing to be scratched as well. And then, of course, you've got the training piece I touched on earlier with having multiple vendors, multiple trainings, the cost of training, the cost of keeping it up to date, the number of people that you need to have, rather than train one person in 20 different vendors, train one person in one vendor, for example. And then, of course, access control speaking for itself. From a privileged access management perspective, NIS2 calls out privileged access management directly, but also, what I found quite interesting, encourages the use of AI. It doesn't necessarily say how you should use AI, but simply says that, well, if AI helps you, then we would encourage that you use it if you are doing things like risk analysis or data analysis of log events and so on. So NIS2 touches a lot of areas. ISO27001 touches a lot of areas. NIS2 is a lot smaller in scope, but there are a lot of controls that marry up, especially when it comes to privileged access management, things like being able to have an access request. In the world of governance, I'd simply request an application. In the world of privilege, I'd request access to an account for a certain period of time, use that account, credential gets rotated, maybe my session's recorded, maybe I don't know the credential and I get logged in automatically. Either way, there is a clear audit record starting with me putting my hand up and saying, I am aware that I am accessing a system that carries risk because I am making a request. This is why typically you wouldn't necessarily go just one click access straight into something. An access request workflow typically gets put in front of it, and I would submit you, Kunal, that that's an example of a process being mandated rather than a technology control being mandated, and that's where NIS2 and ISO line up very nicely.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Alan. That was very comprehensive, I think, for an overview of NIS2. I think you've touched on some really important key points there. So thank you very much for that. So now I think we move on to our final control area we're going to be looking at today, which is the TSA. So let's have a look at TSA at a glance then. Alan, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Telecommunications Security Act is quite an interesting one. So here in the UK, we have a government-sponsored National Cybersecurity Centre, and we had a telecoms supply chain review report from our government, which was basically triggered by the thought that went along these lines. Hey, look, we've got national security, we've got military, and many other moving parts of our government and our country that are going out over private sector communications lines. So that leaves our control when that happens. We should probably do something about that, is the short version. And so they did a supply chain review report, and then the National Cybersecurity Centre brought about a cyber assessment framework, or CAF. For the attendees, I'd recommend you Google it and have a look. It's very easily digestible. A lot of compliance frameworks, when you read through them, is dry, very, very dry reading indeed. But the cyber assessment framework from the National Cybersecurity Centre is pretty good reading if you're looking for some reading material on the fundamentals of cybersecurity postures in the modern age. And they have a lot of recommendations there as well. Now, what they do is they define technical mitigations to reduce risks. The Telecommunications Security Act that was born off the back of that does not dismiss any other regulation. Okay, so it's not like you must do this and not the other things. And it touches a lot of areas. It touches supply chain security. It touches privileged access management, it touches access management, it touches architecture. And I think the thing that stands out to me most about it is it's very, very detailed, very, very detailed indeed. In fact, it reads more like an RFP than a piece of legislation, which is very, very useful. Another comment I'll make in passing, Kunal, is that with all of these compliance frameworks, it's very easy for us to become complacent about upcoming audits. But when you consider that the people who built ISO 27001, the people who built NIS2, the National Cybersecurity Center who did all the research and helped build the Telecommunications Security Act, all of these organizations have spent a lot of money defining what good looks like, which means you don't necessarily have to if you're following these frameworks. And so that's a lot of value that's getting brought to the table in helping take your security postures to the next level. But TSA was actually a joy to read because it was very, very specific indeed about what you must do, how you must do it, and what the expected results should be.
Definitely. It's interesting. They even mention quite a few architectures in the official when you read the TSA manual, let's say. And there's a load of information in there, very, very useful, as you mentioned, Alan. And just picking up on the architecture bit that you mentioned a bit earlier. They advise against what they call the browse-up architecture. Could you explain to us a little bit more what's wrong with the browse-up architecture and what they don't like about this one?
Yeah, so this is a screenshot taken from the Act itself. And so from the guidelines, sorry, I should say. So National Cybersecurity Center released guidelines along with the government releasing the legislation. And this is from the accompanying guidelines, and the guidelines themselves map directly to the regulations. Now, this screenshot basically talks about what I would suggest is what we all know and love as like a typical architecture. I've got my corporate network, I've got my risk carrying devices that would typically be what I would have privileged access to. So there would be a management plane that I would use a jump box to go into. I'd use my tools from the management plane to access the privileged endpoint. Very typical model. They call it browse up. I'm used to thinking of this as a top-down architecture rather than a bottom-up architecture. So there's a little bit of like, there's a little bit of digesting some of the terminology. But what they did was they actually suggested an alternative to this, which I think is also pretty standard practice these days. When you consider like privilege access zones and management zones and so on and so forth. But what they started saying is, look, you need to go into the privileged access zone in order to then access the corporate network or then to access the management zone. Now, there was a lot of detail that carried behind this, okay? So I'm paraphrasing a lot here, okay? But the bottom line here is that they're making specific architectural recommendations and then talking about specific controls that need to be present within those architectures. For example, guidance M1305 maps to like regulations 3, 4, 8, and 12, and that would simply say something like, just on my notes here, modification of databases and systems that define the operation of the network shall require two authorized persons sign off. Things like that, very specific, and it will talk about, down here, dedicated privileged access workstation at the bottom of the picture there, brackets remote via VPN. So they've also got details in here about if you've got people remoting in, this is how they should do it. If you've got people on site, this is how they should do it. There's another area that talks about if people are logging in remotely, you need to be able to have geographic awareness of where they're logging in from. So it was, given the, I think it's unkind to ISO 27001 and NIS2 to use the word fluffy, but this makes it look that way a little bit, in my own opinion, because there's lots of help and guidance around ISO 27001. There's certifying bodies that will come in and actually help you with audits and so on and so forth. There are consultancies out there that actually help with ISO 27001 certifications as well, of course. NIS2 new, bit more of a gray area. ISO can help with that as well. A lot of the guidance in the TSA is very, very specifically targeted to the telecommunications industry. I know that the rest of the EU and North America are looking at the Telecommunications Security Act with eager eyes, because logically it makes sense. You know, you think back to earlier when we talk about NIS2, telcos and DNS providers being a form of critical infrastructure. You imagine if we didn't have any telecommunications, like, you know, that would just be the dark ages straight away overnight. You know, Wi-Fi is part of Maslow's pyramid now. Okay, so the point I'm making is that this is the first of many that we will see from around the world mandating in this industry. And I think as things like NIS2 evolve, then inevitably the guidelines around those will evolve as well, and the specifics about the controls that are required equally would evolve.
Absolutely. I think with the increasing threat of hackers, of insider threats, all that, and the sensitivity of these networks and the computer systems nowadays, I think it's only logical that we get those kind of frameworks in place, and it's prudent that organizations follow them and increase their own security posture as well, I feel. So thanks for that, Alan, for shedding light on that. We talked briefly around, you introduced the One Identity Unified Platform. We can have a look on how that helps us achieve the TSA sort of recommended architecture on this slide. So could you talk a bit around sort of how the unified platform helps?
Yeah, thanks, Kunal. So the reason I'm flashing this up as a reference architecture is that this also has implications on the NIS2 and the ISO side as well, although this is basically an example of a reference architecture for what the TSA is calling a browse down architecture. So on the previous slide, we saw that so we saw the corporate network, the privileged access network, the management plane, and then the operational network. So what we've done is we sort of turned that by 90 degrees. I did warn you I'm a top-down kind of guy. And so, you know, this here, the red dotted line across the top 2/3 and the green dotted line across the top, that area labeled the corporate network. And beneath that red line, that management plane, that privileged access workstation plane that was identified by the TSA in the previous slide. So this is a reference architecture that satisfies more than 2/3 of the Telecommunications Security Act mandates. And it covers many different areas, including identity governance with Identity Manager, includes privileged access management and safeguard. It includes access management with one login, with the MFA, the single sign-on, the location awareness, and so on and so forth. And also, what I would say is the unsung hero, syslog-ng, for routing and collating logs across that. This is a unified, complete solution. Now, other areas of the TSA that this wouldn't necessarily touch, things like supply chain management, things like contracts, things like the signaling plane. There's a whole section in TSA on the signaling plane, and so on and so forth. Technology only takes you so far. Process takes you the rest of the way. We've all heard the old adage of people, process, technology. All of these frameworks, all of these compliance guidelines, legislations, and so on, they are all grounded in that. They are all grounded in people, process, and technology. This technology helps facilitate the processes for the people to remain secure and to operate in a compliant fashion. And although this particular architecture was designed for the Telecommunications Security Act, equally it applies to NIS2 and ISO27001 certification as well.
Amazing. So we can see that how having a unified platform without having to go different vendors, different products, all in one place can help us help organizations achieve compliance with not only with NIS2, not only with TSA, also NIS2 and ISO. And keeping it a bit more specific with NIS2, I believe here we can see also how the exact measures map up to the platform area that One Identity offers as well.
Yeah, and just to briefly comment, so these are the security measure guidances. Now the guidances themselves map to specific regulations in the legislation. Okay, but this represents like just over 2/3 of all of them. And the ones that, just to explain, the color coding highlighted there is where there's overlap. Okay, so some of these you actually need governance and PAM working together in order to satisfy them. And I find that's a very interesting evolution when we look at legislation, because if I think back over the past 10, 12 years, in that time, increasingly so, companies going to tender for IGA have requirements for PAM. Companies going to tender for PAM have requirements for IGA. It's very interesting to me that now legislations are consolidating that as well. We're used to hearing about consolidation in the market. You just heard the pitch from me at the start of this webinar about consolidating silos, and the silos we're consolidating at One Identity. Gartner will talk to you about consolidation. Coverage Cole will talk to you about the identity fabric, of which we were recently announced as a leader in the first leadership compass on specifically the identity fabric, which covers all these domains. Okay, so analysts, governments are now cottoning on to the market, which has been consolidating these silos for years now. And so I found that was quite an interesting standout as well.
Absolutely. This is really really fantastic way of sort of mapping those controls over. So just before we close, Alan, a question that's very commonly asked by people: what challenges typically organizations face in getting compliant? Of course, budgets is always a tough fight. How do you propose a good business case to get that project procured? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a great question. So getting budget released, and you know, I sort of look to the sky and hesitate a little bit, because I feel that pain too of getting budget. I think we all do. And I found that budgets tend to be quite reactionary, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is one of those things where if it's not noisy, then everything's okay. What could be wrong? But then something happens, and then alarm bells go off, and then a press release goes out, and then we have to go and do something about it. Funding-wise, it can be very reactionary, and that's unfortunately a side effect of our industry. However, these compliance frameworks are a very proactive way of securing budget. If an organization gets ISO certified, that's a very positive step and has a knock-on effect to a number of different areas. Okay, so if you're a European organization and NIS2 is on the horizon and you're not ISO certified, that's a great starting point for a business case to get ISO certified. Okay, because they're going to hold you by the hand through your organization to get you to a point where the majority of the work is done. The rest of it is the supply chain stuff, you know. So that's one piece I put. But also, one of my favorite quotes was for a CISO I was talking to a couple of years ago. He said, "Never waste a good calamity." I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he goes, "Well, some of the times when I've secured the most budget is when there's been a problem, but it's never a problem until it's a problem." And I said, "Yeah, I know how that feels. Yeah, trust me." Because if you've got an upcoming audit, then you may be inclined to prepare for that audit. But if you have a failed audit point, you would be more inclined to close that audit point. If you don't close that audit point and you risk a fine as a result, you're going to get the budget. And that's what I thought he meant. And he said, no. It works more like this. The auditors are very, very welcome in my organization, because if I've got something that I need to get done over here, then I can lead the auditors over there and I say, come over here. See this? See this? Write it down. Make sure you've written it down. Okay, thanks very much. And then he'd let them go, let them highlight it. Then he's got his business case. And I thought, what a sad way to live. But he's like, honestly, it's the easiest way for me to get things done. And so, you know, that I think in its own way highlights the value of having a compliance framework in place, regardless of what it is. If you've got ISO 27001 in, it gives you credibility, okay? It gives you that baseline. You're not going to get punished if you don't get it, but it opens the door to removing punishments from other things like NIS2, TSA, SOX, PCI, so on and so on and so on and so forth. So yeah, everyone's going to have the challenge of making the business case. Compliance frameworks can actually help with that business case. Your compliance officers are your friends, not your enemies.
Perfect. That's a very strong statement, a closing statement there, Alan. So we are out of time, and I would love to. I'd like to thank all our participants, and a special thanks to you, Alan, for giving such a comprehensive overview of such detailed frameworks. I think you've distilled them down beautifully into this webinar, and with One Identity's unified platform and IC Consult's years of experience and expertise, I think we can help your organizations be fully compliant with these frameworks and increase your security posture and protect your organization's key assets.
Thank you all, and thank you, Kunal.
Thank you, Alan. Bye-bye.